podcast about comics. A podcast about comics.
Identities is in the trailer. There's so many nods to the threes. Like right out of the gate when he pops up in the bed,
he turns around.
He turns and you see three reflections, and he's looking back, terrified at something else. And it's like, okay, so those are the three, right? Is that there's Steven, there's Jake, and then there's Mark. Is he looking at Moon Knight? Is he looking at Khonshu? And we'll get into Khonshu if you guys don't know that name yet. Yeah. But at that point, it's really interesting that these little subtle nods are already there, and that's what gets me excited as a fan of Moon Knight, is that they know, all right, this has so much depth that these little subtle details are going to matter.
Yeah.
And those reflections keep kind of playing through over and over again in the trailer when he's in the museum, and all of a sudden you see him walk forward, and then the other two reflections. That one reacts one way, and the other one watches the other reflection, and then you're just like,
"What is
happening? Whoa, what is going on
trippy,
here?"
Man.
And
it's so trippy.
It's interesting too that this is all leading up to Multiverse of Madness, and it's already kind of, I think, getting us primed for, hey, the MCU. We've seen it in certain ways, but we're about to see it in a whole different light, right?
Whole different light,
and Moon Knight has always been that kind of niche corner of Marvel Comics that I really enjoy, because I'm a horror movie fan, I'm a paranormal movie fan, and Moon Knight always kind of like walked between those two spectrums, and I think that's what we're going to get in this show.
Yeah, very much. I mean, we've gotten, what's the darkest we've gotten from a Marvel movie is U.S. Agent plummeting somebody and blood on the shoulder.
Yeah.
On the shield.
On the shield.
You don't see the person, but you see the blood on the shield. I think this time around, even though, they still have parameters and what they have to work into, right, with under the Disney banner, but we're going to see more violence. We're going to see it get darker and grittier. We already see the man dead falling out of the truck.
Yeah. Well, it has to. And that was one of my fears of this going on to Disney+. Because for the longest time, going back to the Netflix Marvel series, there was little nods here and there where when that was in its full prime, I was like, oh, we're going to get Moon Knight. We have to. It's kind of leading up to this, right? That is when we were first talking about the possibility of Midnight Suns already, because we had Daredevil, we had Punisher. We're like, oh my gosh, this could lead to something, especially it's in Hell's Kitchen, it's in New York. This is primed for Mark Spector to pop up. And the brutality, the serious level of those shows, the tone of those shows, that is the realm that Moon Knight lives in.
Yes.
And it's funny because in the comics, there's times where I know you're aware of this. Frank Castle, a.k.a. Punisher, for those of you who aren't familiar, gets checked by Moon Knight.
Yep.
And he even stops and is like, man, I know I'm pretty brutal, but
you are a little bit different.
I don't even go to that level. Yeah. So that's where I did have the fear when it first was announced that Moon Knight was going to be on Disney+. I'm just like, I don't know if they're going to be able to register or deliver what Moon Knight
How
really
did you feel when Feige said, that they will be dialing up the violence?
Relieved.
Okay.
Relieved, and it's not only for the violence, I think it's the tone of the story.
Yeah.
And because this is, I think, also a very important story to tell, because it's dealing with a character in the Marvel Universe that is different than most characters, because he's dealing with a psychological problem. And I think that's something that you don't see with too many Marvel characters. You do see Marvel characters, and that's one of the things I think that most fans really enjoy about the Marvel Universe, is that they have everyday problems that you can identify with. But this is an everyday problem that a lot of people have to deal with, anything from insomnia to dissociative identity disorder. And I think it's going to be very powerful if Marvel can tell that story right.
The right way.
And have the light that is necessary to be shown upon in this setting of an entire MCU series. So I think that's really important, and I'm really curious to see how that's going to play out in something that is TV-14 and not TVMA.
Well, I am very grateful that we're getting that, right? We finally are getting people who struggle with disorders. Everybody from people who are hearing impaired.
Yeah.
Right? We just get to see Makari and Echo.
Mm-hmm.
and somebody who's blind like Matt Murdock.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting people who deal with dissociative identity disorder,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Marvel isn't afraid to cross the threshold and talk about something sensitive that the rest of the world may shun or look down upon or be afraid to talk about.
Well, Falcon
Winter Soldier.
I mean, the serious tone of that show and what that brought to light.
And I think, I'm grateful that we are getting these things. And again, it was such a big deal to not speak about such things. And now Marvel is like, these things are happening in our everyday world.
Yeah.
We need to address these things.
Yeah. So that had me apprehensive at first, but now seeing everything kind of come together and we're so close, like we're literally
right there. Yeah.
I'm really excited and more so relieved, and I just now have anticipation and like genuine excitement for the show, because for the longest time I still kind of was on pins and needles of whether this was going to play out right. And I know you and I have had plenty of conversations and it's like, yeah, but it's on Disney Plus, it's on Disney Plus. Like, the comics, we know the comics, and we know what happens in those comics. We know how brutal and some of these scenes happen.
Some of them, when they take them away, we like, why did you take them away? But then a part of us is like, okay, I understand that. But now we're now scratching the surface of stuff that has to be talked about, right? And it's just, I'm excited to see how they explore that.
Yeah.
One of the things is the ones who's pulling the strings for Mark Spector a lot of times, is, you want to talk about it, this figure that's looming, and we've seen him in the trailer. Everything from chasing Mark down the corridor, he's running, he jumps in the elevator, and we see when he's running this shadow behind him.
Yeah.
Right. You want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah. So I made mention of his name. His name is Khonshu. He is within the Marvel universe the Egyptian god. He's the moon god. Again, within the Marvel universe, he's the son of Ra, and he is what gives Mark. I'm trying to do it without the spoiler, right? So we're gonna just say that he is.
Oh, he come into contact.
He comes in contact with Mark, and in the comics is what dubs Mark the Moon Knight. How about that? That's the most non-spoiler way of doing that, right? Yeah. So in the comics, let's just go ahead and kind of dive down. I do have some of the key issues here of the Moon Knight spectrum. We're going to go ahead, seeing that we're talking about Khonshu, let's go ahead and skip over to Khonshu.
Okay.
So this is actually one of the amazing hero issues from back in the day. This is when they first started talking about, hey, Moon Knight is about to actually get his very first issue. So this is Amazing Heroes, for those of you who aren't familiar with, is kind of just like a preview issue. It just tells you like, hey, this is what's coming out, check it out. And Khonshu, if you take a look here, in this form, he was actually drawn more so as a traditional Egyptian god.
Yes.
He did not have the form that we saw in this trailer.
No.
That form that you see in this trailer is a more modern take of Khonshu.
Yeah.
Khonshu in the original comics literally looked like anything you would see if you went to the museum of history in any city in Egypt, and is just a classic totem god.
A menacing pharaoh.
Correct. Yeah.
He had that pharaoh presence.
Very, very, very pharaoh-like for sure. He had the entire regalia of the headpiece, and he carried a staff. The nod to the moon was within the actual headpiece of what he wore, and the staff as well. So those nods that were from the original Khonshu carried over in the reinterpretation that we see in the trailer, and where that originally came from. So we're going to keep going down the old rabbit hole here of the comics to get to... this is actually a little bit more modern interpretation of Khonshu, but you also see some of the nods to how we see Moon Knight's attire in the trailer, where the nods to the wrappings. But here again, Khonshu is still in a deity form, but in the background here you can see the crescent staff of Khonshu. Yeah. And the relationship that Khonshu has with Moon Knight without getting too far into it, because again, I'm trying to do this in the most non-spoiler way. It's a complicated one.
Yeah.
It's not.
Well, I guess it has to be complicated because you're dealing with an Egyptian god deity and you're dealing with a human.
Yes.
Right? So some of it is somewhat spiritual, you'll say.
Yeah, but it's not like your cliche that you would think like, oh, there's an Egyptian god who is communicating with me, so this has got to be a
Talks to me at night when I go to bed.
Yeah, it's got to be a great relationship kind of situation where like I get to be the Moon Knight because of this deity, and we have, we're just buddy. If you haven't picked up from it from the trailer, he's running from Khonshu multiple times too. It's not we're best friends skipping through the woods together kind of situation.
Yeah, it's definitely not.
And he's already dealing with the fact he's got 3 identities swarming around his head, and now he's got an Egyptian god also floating around.
So we definitely see how complex it could be.
So
it's like having a Monday every day.
Yeah.
Mondays.
We happen to be filming this on a Monday.
On the Monday.
Too, so obviously down the road, we're not sure when this is going to air, but this has also context
on a Monday. So imagine having those days every day.
Every day.
All day.
Sleeplessly. Because Mark doesn't get too much sleep, unfortunately.
He doesn't.
So going with Khonshu from the Egyptian god cliche pharaoh look, he had a reimagination when it came to the Warren Ellis, Declan Shalvey, and Jordan Belair story. And that's where we actually start seeing Khonshu take on the form of, and you can actually just see it on the cover here, of the bird-like form.
Bird-like form with the beak skull.
The beak skull, and at that point, he's more of a nod to the mummy. Yeah. And the more Egyptian cliche mummy wrapping, mummification, everything that goes into...
While still carrying the crescent moon staff.
Correct.
His limbs are a little bit more longer, lankier.
Yeah, so I love this reinterpretation of Khonshu. This run, if you want something quick that's not that long, I think the whole run is maybe 16, 17 issues. Don't quote me on that. It's been a minute since I read it. But it's fantastic. It's a newer run, but it does give you backstory on Moon Knight, and it also gives you a really cool interpretation of everything leading up to this run of Moon Knight. Because Moon Knight does go back, some of his first appearances, seeing if we're going to talk about first appearances, it goes back to Werewolf by Night.
Yeah. Do you think that's a character we're going to get in this?
So, I know you and I go back and forth on this.
Yeah.
In the trailer, the first time we saw the trailer, he's beating the crap out of something in that bathroom. I think it's a bathroom.
On the floor.
On the floor. And at first, there was nothing, because Marvel's loving to do this thing, right? You watch trailer, you think you have it understand, or you understand what you're seeing, right? And then all of a sudden you watch it again, they're like, hey, that wasn't there last time. They're deleting things, they're blotting things out. But in the most recent one, you see him wailing on a form of something that could be one of two things. I'm kind of leaning, if they're going to go the origin story, it could be Werewolf by Night. Mm-hmm. Just a more modern interpretation of a werewolf. Because up until now, we haven't seen a werewolf in the MCU. So we don't know how they're going to look. And werewolves, if you go and look at them in the history of film,
the way their legs are,
they can look different from, you have your underworld Lycan, and you have Harry Potter werewolves, and you have the cliche werewolves from your your Universal monsters.
And then you have your True Blood werewolves.
You have True Blood werewolves. There's all different kinds of werewolves. So we don't know what the Marvel MCU werewolf is going to look like. So that could be a werewolf. Or it could be one of the Anubis jackals, which is getting a little bit more deeper into a little bit of Moon Knight's lore there. So,
but here's the thing. If they're going to be giving us a true Moon Knight story, I could see them go that deep to where that is an Anubis jackal. And I think that was the thing that sold it for me. Like, I was watching the head shape, right? Because again, the first time we watched it, the second time we go back in, we're like, whoa, hey. And I looked at his head, his legs and everything looked like it could be one of them lichens, right? Yeah. But then I looked at the head, because I think at a quick moment the head like snaps, right? And I'm, again, pause, rewind, pause. I'm like, that's an Anubis jackal head. That's an Anubis jackal head. And that's why I'm like, I think they're going to go just a little bit deeper into the story, you know.
But I hope they do some sort of nod, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like they've always done a nod to origin stories in some sort of way. But I think it's already been confirmed, if I'm not mistaken, that Werewolf by Night is going to have some sort of...
We are going to be getting a Werewolf by Night, but I'm not sure if it's this or something later on is coming. Some kind of Halloween special.
So it would be weird, in my opinion, to have Moon Knight and not have Werewolf by Night. Yeah. Because without Werewolf by Night, backstory from a comic book reference, Moon Knight never actually, for the longest time, was a standalone character. He would show up, he'd have his guest appearances, fans loved the way he looked, and they just kept writing into Marvel Comics being like, can you please bring back this Moon Knight character? Please bring back this Moon Knight character. And it took a long time for Marvel to realize, like, hey, we have something here. Yeah. And it really wasn't until years later, because he had Werewolf by Night, and he popped in there, and he actually
that was his first appearance, right?
This was his very first appearance. Yeah. Was Werewolf by Night, and he actually was almost at first portrayed as the bad guy, but once you start reading the run in Werewolf by Night, he realizes he like shows up and he was a hired mercenary, and then realizes he was not really hired by the right team in the issues, and he kind of, at that point, you're like, oh, he's kind of more of a vigilante, and that's where he takes on that role, and he ends up helping out, but I don't want to get too far into that either. Yeah. Just read the comics, guys. Yeah. That's all you gotta do. Great character. But it isn't until Marvel Spotlight on the Moon Knight where he actually gets his own standalone, and this is the first issue where he actually gets a standalone comic. He's still not actually in his own run at this point. Mm-hmm. And this is still Marvel testing the waters. A lot of these ancillary characters, for the longest time, and Moon Knight was definitely one of those, never actually got their own run until, for Marvel Comics, it was proven, like, one, there's a fandom behind the character, and two, it's going to sell comics. Because when it comes down to it, they need to make sure they're going to have comics sold. And when a comic book gets put on the shelf and they do everything to get the artist, and they pay the artist, and they print it, and it doesn't sell, well, then unfortunately it gets pulled from the shelf. Yeah. So they kept trying, and they finally did hit it, and it wasn't until 1980, and this is the premiere issue where you get Moon Knight in his standalone comic. And then the rest is kind of history from there. And he has this really kind of test and trial history in Marvel Comics, not as a character, but of being printed, and then unfortunately the run gets dropped because it doesn't sell enough, but there's always been a cult following for the character.
A.P.A.C.